We're the two teachers. Welcome to the Strangest Things.
Timeless talk about today's topics.
Andy, here's the strangest thing this week. The budget seemingly just passed, but no one's talking about the details of the budget. They're all talking about what happens next, tax cuts.
Right, budgeting at any level of government. Dan, I don't care if you're talking about the federal national government or your county board, budgeting is a list of your priorities in your policy making. And when you pass a budget, certainly a lot of the attention here is that by passing the budget, it's easier for the Republican Congress to pass tax reform. But the details matter because it sets the agenda for the national government.
Well, Andy, here's the detail that matters. By passing the budget, it kicks in certain budget rules, which means now that the Senate Republicans can pass tax cuts without a filibuster. So this whole budget thing, the strangest thing is we should be talking about budget priorities, but when you look at the news stories, they're all talking about what happens next, and also that within this budget debate also came this little detail that they might be able to drill in Alaska. Andy, budget? What are we talking about?
Well, remember, the budget is a law, and we have that law that was written in 1974 during the Gerald Ford administration, in which Congress essentially said that there's a process for passing the budget. The president writes the budget. He writes the budget with the help of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. He gives his draft, but then Congress really comes up with the nitty-gritty details of the budget because essentially the budget is a law. So they pass the budget just like a law, and then it's up to the president to actually sign the budget. That's the budget-making process because, yes, Dan, the budget is a law, and much of that budgeting impacts how policies are enforced, or in some cases, not enforced.
Andy, is it strange that they haven't made a big deal about the details of the budget? Is this strange? I mean, is this just a shell game to get to something else, or does the budget matter?
The budget always matters, and it certainly seems that because there's so much attention on the next big legislative action by President Trump in the U.S. Congress, and that's tax reform, it certainly seems like a lot of the media attention is more focused on the next step rather than the details of this particular budget.
Strangest things. Andy, you know, friends don't lie, and I have a bit of a truth ache, I have to admit. The Supreme Court hearing a lot of high-profile cases right now, and our Chief Justice, John Roberts, talking about not getting involved in the gobbledygook of politics. When discussing the gerrymandering case, he said, you know, this Supreme Court doesn't want to get involved in political decisions. Andy, the Supreme Court above politics? Boy, I've got a bit of a truth ache. I think our Supreme Court has been involved in politics for a long time.
Well, it is the great irony of the judicial branch, particularly the Supreme Court, this depiction of Lady Justice, this metaphor of certainly the scales weighing justice is accurate. The sword, the enforcement of justice, but then you have that blindfold, which is meant to be that justice is blind towards discrimination, towards age, towards race, towards gender. But we know that these 9 Supreme Court judges and every federal judge gets their job these days in a highly, highly political partisan process. And we know that Republicans appoint conservatives to the federal bench. We know that Democrats appoint liberals to the federal judiciary. And yet we still have this notion that the Supreme Court is above politics.
Yeah, Merrick Garland wasn't denied a vote of confirmation because of his qualifications. It seems to me he was too liberal. Neil Gorsuch, boy, no problem confirming him with a clear Senate Republican majority. Andy, above politics?
And we know the Democrats have played that game too, going back to the famous Judge Robert Bork, when Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Joe Biden really tanked Robert Bork's chances to be on the Supreme Court, not because of Judge Bork's qualifications, but because he was deemed to be too conservative for approval by the U.S. Senate.
Saying, Andy, it's time to walk through the curiosity door, and we get a lot of questions. And boy, the big one for today, curiosity door, the JFK files are being released. We've been waiting for this for so long. Andy, here we go again. More conspiracies? This sounds like fake news to
Well,
me.
with almost 3,000 documents to be revealed, plus all those documents that have already been revealed, but the redactions will now be made public, you know that there's going to be plenty of meat in there for the conspiracy theorists who allege that maybe there was a group assassination of JFK, who alleged that the Soviets or the mafia or the Cubans were behind the assassination of JFK. It's there's going to be something for everybody.
We ought to be
guaranteed.
ashamed of ourselves for
Why?
all these conspiracy theorists. Listen, I would argue that this notion of these grand conspiracies going back to the 1960s made room for Trump's message and rhetoric that, there's a lot of fake news out there. You can't trust the establishment. Andy, when they didn't trust the Warren Commission back in the 1960s, it opened the way for the establishment and for the elites to be questioned.
But
Andy,
Dan, this is not a Trump
Lee
thing.
Harvey Oswald.
This is not a Trump thing. Conspiracy theorists existed well before the Trump presidency, on both the left and the right.
Yeah,
the reality
JFK
is,
assassination.
Dan, the reality is that in the 1960s and early 1970s, you had three issues that people couldn't resolve because they didn't trust the institutions. And one was who was responsible for the JFK assassination, the carrying out of the Vietnam War policy, which we now know the government lied to the American people repeatedly, and then, of course, Watergate. And so those are on both sides. You had questions about legitimacy of governmental institutions. And yes, you're right. We have not seen the recover from doubting government because anything that happens now that's controversial or complicated, you already automatically have those people on the left and the right kind of brewing these theories about some more complicated scandal. And yes, I think we can go back to the 1960s and really trace it back to those events.
Boy, we've lost trust in our institutions, and boy, do I miss it. This has been The Strangest Things.
We're the two teachers.
No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.